All About You isn't just a title, it does what it says on the tin. I'm Sheila, your host, and I have conversations with people about their extraordinary lives and achievements as they follow their dreams. Past episodes have included a tattoo artist, a visionary dreamer, an insightful psychologist, a genealogist, an opera singer, and a London-backed cabbie, and a yacht nanny, to name a few. So now let's meet this week's guest.
Welcome to the All About You podcast. And today I have a conversation with Daniel, and we are going to be talking about using podcasting as a way to improve our language skills, particularly used when we are learning another language. So Daniel, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Sheila. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm looking forward to this. This is our very first video podcast, so something very, very different. So, Daniel, we're talking about podcasting as using that as a medium to help with language learning. So that's quite an interesting topic. So do you want to introduce yourself and how you got into podcasting and started using it as a way of language learning?
Yeah, of course. So I am Daniel. I come from Switzerland, from the German-speaking part of Switzerland. And I grew up bilingually, Spanish because my father comes from Argentina, and Swiss German because my mother comes from Switzerland. I have always been surrounded by many different languages. And also when I started school, or let's say in the third grade, I had to learn French. And so it was always a thing that I was very passionate about. And then at 17, I had my very first English lesson. And somehow I fell in love with English. And yeah, as it happens, I discovered podcasts. And back in the day, they were not so common, right? And there were a lot of English podcasts, but no German podcast. And then I just listened for hours and hours to different content. And that was like my main method to learn English, but almost always in a very passive way by listening to a lot of English. Yeah, that was how it started.
So you use podcasts to help you learn other languages, and then you got into podcasting yourself. So how did that change start from sort of being the student to thinking, okay, I want to actually produce these for other language learners?
That was actually a very, very slow process because I am an introvert, and for me, even in my mother tongue, I'm not a very talkative person. I am more the listener type. And for me, it was really stepping outside of my comfort zone. But as I was an avid podcast listener and I really loved to listen to content, how to learn a language, I decided to start speaking as well, because I had no practice partners here in Switzerland. And I had no reasons to use English in my day-to-day life. I didn't know anybody who speaks English. I first thought I could do it in Swiss German or in Standard German, but I am very insecure when it comes to my dialect, also because it is supposed to be a little bit exotic, even here in Switzerland, where I grew up. Yeah, right. It would embarrass me to listen to myself, or I don't know. I just couldn't imagine myself speaking in my own mother tongue. It sounds really strange, I know. So for me, it was easier to start out a podcast in English than to use my own language. So that was like the starting point. And also, I wanted to become fluent in English. And in the very beginning, I would just write a script and then read it out loud. So yeah, it was a really slow process. And maybe I should mention that I started back in 2016. And I can remember that even my podcast cover for my Fluent podcast, which is the name, was just a sticky note, a yellow sticky note where I have jotted down the name, my Fluent podcast, and I could upload it. I think it was on Stitcher, and it was just ridiculous because you could see all the fancy covers of other podcasts, and then all of a sudden my cover stick out with this sticky note. And it's just hilarious, but I love it because the crucial thing when it comes to learning a language is also to just start out and to keep going. And that's what I basically did because I had no experience in podcasting, and I just went on and on until today.
I mean, I think that is a fantastic story, Danielle, about the sticky note, because when you talk to people about, yes, I have a podcast, they have this vision of thousands of euros or pounds worth of equipment, this fancy studio, a team of people. And yes, a lot of people do have that. I'm not one of those people. And I think your story is just saying, just your sticky note, yeah, for some time that was the cover art for your podcast. And I think that's great because we all have to start somewhere. You don't start with a huge budget for your podcast. You start with a microphone, download some software, and just basically go for it. So I think that is such an inspiring story for people who are thinking about getting into the podcast. And I think, you know, when you're talking about language learning, it is step by step by step. It's not a straight line. It doesn't go straight up. It's got lumps and bumps and detours. Books get thrown across the room. I'm never doing this again. Absolutely. You go back the next day. All right, I understand it now. It's frustrating, but it also can be so rewarding. So yeah, interesting points there, definitely.
Yeah, and may I add something to it? Because actually what I did was, my goal was to become fluent, and that's why my podcast name is My Fluent Podcast. But actually, it's not a very smart goal, not at all, because usually the experts would tell you that you should have smart goals, right? And my goal was not specific. Nevertheless, in my opinion, I reached my goal because these days I can conduct interviews with people from all over the world. And I had no time pressure. So it's really a hobby of mine. Yeah.
So if we talk about your podcast, so you've got the Fluent podcast where you interview different guests. What's your experience of finding those guests that you have on your show?
Well, I must say that these days it has become very easy to find guests. It was not like that when I started out in 2016, because back in the day, you really had to explain what you were going for. And people, they didn't understand it because they didn't know what a podcast was. So actually, these days it has become really easy. And oftentimes I would reach out also to podcasters, mainly to podcasters which I love. So I can talk about topics that I am familiar with. And also I try to conduct interviews with language learners, which is also very interesting. And I try to have a very nice mix of non-native speakers and English native speakers. So for me, it is really important to cover all of them because, in my opinion, everyone has a story to tell. I come across a guest or a potential guest, and maybe the guest would say, no, I don't want to come because I don't have anything to tell. But actually, that is not true. And oftentimes these stories would actually be the best stories because everyone has an important story to tell.
I mean, I so relate to that because obviously my podcast is called All About You. And I came across that idea because I was listening to podcasts. And there are so many podcasts about famous people and you can listen to their life story. And I thought, everybody's got a story, a travel, an experience, something they've done. And I thought, maybe I can put the two together. And that's what I do. So one day we're talking about someone's travel, then I'll get somebody who's, passionate about books or something. And it's so true. Everybody has a story. And some people are happy to say, well, I could talk about this, that, and the other. And you think, oh my God, that's amazing. You've been here and you've done that. And for me, one of the greatest things I've done is telling somebody's life story. It was, I think, 13 different podcasts. They had traveled around the world with their job for 47 years. And we did a podcast last summer on every single country.
Wow.
And it was a labor of love for both of us. We spent hours doing all the recordings. But for me, somebody's life story, because a lot of people say, oh, I'm writing my life story. I'm not an author. It's a labor of love. A lot of those books never make it to being published. Having this man's life story recorded, it's there for him, for his family, for his grandchildren, for generations to come. I feel incredibly proud to have somebody's life story that may never make it into a book because of that writing process. But to sit down and talk about it, to me, is genius.
Yes.
Everybody can talk, but not everybody wants to or feels able to write a book.
Absolutely. And it's invaluable, right? So for me, I don't earn money with my podcasts because it's a labor of love. But to me, it's invaluable to make these connections and to learn about those stories. And also for me, because I could grow as a person as well. And it's like having a connection with people who, you don't know them, but in a way, you know them because you make these little connections.
And I think having a podcast, I mean, especially, we're recording over Skype, you're in Switzerland, I'm in Spain. You get access to people that you would probably never come across in your daily life. And to me, the education I receive from these guests, whether it's about their travel or experiences, or whether it's about one of their passions, the education I receive is absolutely phenomenal. I am just so blessed. And another thing that always comes up when you say you have a podcast, oh, how much money do you earn? Do you have sponsors? Do you get freebies? And I would say a lot of people out there, it's their main source of income. They're selling courses, books, etc., etc. That is absolutely fine. However, for me, because I'm telling somebody's life story or it's talking about their passion or experience, to me, that is an honor and a privilege. And I would never, ever consider making money off of that. I always joke and say, well, if somebody wants to buy me a new MacBook, that would be lovely. And I know a lot of people have, Patreon or buy me a beer. I'm not going down those routes because I think, these people are spending time and effort in doing the podcast with me, giving me and my listeners this amazing education or insight or inspiring them to do things. That's payment enough. Absolutely.
Yes, I couldn't agree more.
I mean, there's a lot of money to be made in the world of podcasting. And, you look at sort of the top 10 podcasters. Yeah, but that's not what my podcast is about. And I absolutely adore my podcast. I feel so blessed and honored with the people who come on and talk about things. Yeah, I absolutely love it. Absolutely love it.
And
So
when did you start your podcast?
I've been going for about 2.5 years now. And for the first 2 years, it was a weekly podcast on a Sunday evening. But this year, I took the decision to go every other week. And I have to say, it's made it a lot easier. And more guests seem to be sort of landing in my diary, which is rather nice. So yeah, it's much more workable. I think a lot of people don't realize how much work goes into a podcast. It's not just having a conversation with somebody
Yes.
and it goes up. No. You've got several conversations before the editing, but yeah, it's cool. I love it. Absolutely love it.
Yeah, the other day I came across an episode of English for Curious Minds. It's a podcast which I love, and the host there spoke about the making of his podcast. And he told us that it took him 8 to 20 hours to produce one single podcast. And of course, also all the social media around it that comes with it. So it's really huge. But well, in his case, we have to add that it has become his profession. So
Yeah, I always say mine is a passion project. You know, it's not a work or anything like that. But yeah, still love it. So Daniel, you've got my Fluent podcast, but you've also got the Vocab Man. Can we talk about that?
yes, sure. So the Vocab Man is like an audio notebook, basically. So whenever I come across a fancy expression that I want to learn, or this could be even from an interview that I conducted on my Fluent podcast, I would grab a little snippet and then build a podcast episode on the Vocab Man. And then I would explain it, give examples, and insert maybe some audio files. And it's just a cool way for me to learn new expressions, but also others can learn with me. Basically, it's learning with a learner, right? And I also think that it is much more fun to learn together than just alone.
I mean, it's very interesting when you are learning another language, I think, as you are older, because children are sponges. They just absorb vocabulary. And I'm sure you're the same in Switzerland. You know, you meet a lot of kids and they are bilingual, trilingual, and it's just incredible. You know, maybe the mother is one nationality, the father is another, and generally learning English as well. I mean, that is fantastic. And I think the gift those children will realise as they get older they have got, because they haven't had to sit down with the books. They haven't had to go to classes. You know, from a very young age, they've absorbed an awful lot of vocabulary and they don't even realise they're learning it.
Yeah.
As an adult learner, we are very much, okay, we need to buy the book, we have a dictionary, we use podcasts, we use YouTube, all these different resources to learn another language. But I think as an adult, it's so much harder. When I have conversations with people, a lot of people I meet from all over the world here, they're all learning Spanish, and they just say the same thing. We don't understand the grammar in our own language, and that causes a problem when we're trying to understand the grammar in Spanish, for obviously my case here. And that is a big problem, because Spanish, and I don't know about German, Italian, is generally taught going down the grammar route. We don't start off with, okay, let's work out how we can order a coffee, how we can order a sandwich, where the bank is, and how, you know, where's the bus stop.
It's the same here in Switzerland.
Yeah. And I think this is the problem, because the very first thing people come across is, I don't understand a grammar point in my own language, let alone in Spanish. So they have to literally sort of go and get a grammar book in English, understand it in English, to say, okay, I understand in English, right, so the equivalent is this in Spanish. And that is a real big eye-opener for people learning Spanish, is our lack of grammar.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Daniel, in your opinion, what do you think is the best way to go about starting to learn a language?
The best way, well, starting a new language. Okay, I would say just try to get an overview of the language. This could be just by reading a Wikipedia article, just to see how the language is made up, and then try to learn vocabulary words, maybe like the most 1,000 used words, because there are these frequency lists on the internet. I would focus on that, right? And then once you have a certain amount of vocabulary, I would listen to podcasts in your target language. Because, yeah, well, at least in my experience, I really like learning with audio. And for example, I am learning Italian, and my method there right now is I just listen to podcasts. But these are very short podcasts, and they come with transcripts and translations. So the more I am listening to it, the better I can understand it. So I will go by listening to a lot of, to get a lot of exposure. But it's a huge question, Sheila, because everyone is different, and it also depends on the language that you are focusing. Because, for instance, Italian is very similar to Spanish, and I am able to understand Spanish. And it has also similarities with French even. So for me, it is really easy to understand. But let's say if I were to learn Chinese, then it would be a completely different story, I guess.
I think one thing that I have really learned about myself in learning Spanish is the type of learner I am. I am very much a visual learner. So for me, a podcast on YouTube or a YouTube video where you've got the teacher conjugating the verbs and you can see the verbs as they come up on the blackboard or on the whiteboard is absolutely brilliant. And for me, to actually listen to audio, but I can follow the transcript as well, really, really works. Highlighters are my best friend, because for people that aren't familiar, I'm pretty sure it's the same in Italian, but in Spanish, everything has a gender. So you may learn the word for bottle or water or dog, but is it masculine or feminine? And that is a huge thing as an English speaker, to try and get your head round the fact everything is either going to be masculine or female. So right from the very beginning, a pink and a blue highlighter. Okay, everything in pink, feminine, everything in blue, masculine, which works to a certain extent. And then you get certain words which are not what they should be. So for me, as a visual learner, reading things while I'm listening is brilliant. And highlighting vocabulary. If I'm reading a page in a book and new vocabulary comes up, that gets highlighted in orange. For me, as a visual learner, and I think it's really understanding how you learn. Some people just are happy to listen and repeat. Other people like to write down lists of vocabulary. What can they remember? That type of thing. So I think you learn an awful lot about yourself when you start learning another language.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so too. Yes.
So I think once you find out what kind of a learner are you, are you somebody that can spend 1 hour with your head and the books? That's great. Or are you somebody who, no, I'm quite happy to watch a 5-minute video, maybe make a few notes, and then that's my language learning for the day done? You know, are you using something like an app on a phone, which is very popular? Me, I just hate anything like that. That's just not going to work for me. But that's great, because I know that wouldn't interest me. Having the technology on my phone I just don't, that doesn't float my boat, so to speak. But there are so many different ways out there, as well as going to classes, having a private tutor. But I think a big thing you learning another language, is how best you learn. And once you sort that out, I think that really puts you on a good path. What works for you may be totally different to somebody else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also want to say that I am also a highlighter, right? I love highlighting stuff. So, for example, even this interview, let's say if I put it into my software, into my editing software, first thing I would do is to highlight the expression that you used before, to wrap your head around something.
Yeah.
So then I would highlight it, and then I have the text, I have the spoken word, and I can save it somewhere digitally. It's just also how I love learning. And even when I am listening to an English podcast, I can highlight things, because the app that I'm using, it's called Snipped, and Snipped generates, I think it comes from artificial intelligence. It can make the transcript, and then you can also highlight some passages. And then I save it into a specific folder. And then it's also like my digital notebook, my vocabulary notebook. And I have all my expressions saved up, and I can go back to the podcast and listen to it. And the good thing is that I have an expression, and I have also the context, right? And it's not just like an artificial example or something like that. No, it has been used in a podcast or in an interview, and that are the expressions that I'm looking for. For example, on my Vocab Man podcast, I try to learn practical expressions. I will give you an example or two. It slipped my mind, or to pick someone's brain, or your guess is as good as mine. So I think these are expressions that you would not necessarily find in a textbook, but I find them in conversations, and then I try to learn them.
I think it can be incredibly overwhelming, because when you start to learn a language, there's vocabulary, there's grammar, there's expressions. And I think, okay, I've got to listen to things, I've got to read things, I've got the grammar, I've got to speak. It can become incredibly overwhelming very, very quickly. And I think, if only it sort of went up as a nice, gentle curve, you're just going, it doesn't. It goes up.
Yeah.
You have tremendous highs, tremendous lows, and a lot sort of in the middle. And I always think language learning is rather like children. If you see a child every day, you don't see their development. You don't see the changes. If you see a child once a month or once every couple of months, oh my God, the child's grown, their body's changing, their hair's longer. And I equate language learning the same. We often don't see how we are progressing. It's only when our friends sort of go, oh, so when did you learn that expression or that vocabulary? Or, oh, yeah, you're pronouncing that better. They see the change, but I don't think we do. And that can be incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, unless you have your own podcast and you can go back to your first episode and compare.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, a lot of people say, even with a podcast anyway, my God, when I go back to the first one, now, we're quite confidently to speak quite openly. I know a lot of people use scripts. I don't, because it's not about me speaking, it's the guest. But yeah, it's seeing that progression that is so important. So Daniel, what are the future plans for you with your language learning and the podcasts?
Yeah, so my next goal is to get fluent in Italian. So basically, I try to do the same thing that I did with my Fluent podcast, but in Italian. But the thing is, I am scared. So I have 2 or 3 potential guests, but yeah, something is holding me back because I have no experience in talking in Italian. So it will be really hard in the beginning. But the right thing to do would be to really fix the date and the time and then just roll with it.
Very good. Very common expression. Let's roll with it. Absolutely. And I think as well, you sort of, when you talk to people, no matter what project they're on, and they're, well, yeah, it's nearly ready and I've just got to do this, I've just got to do that. We want to produce something perfect from day one. And no matter what you're doing, that doesn't happen. Sometimes you just have to just go for it. And that at least gives you a starting point, and we can say, okay, well, that was the first one. This is what I would change for the second one. And I think that's exactly the same in anything you do.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
You just need to have that first one. And yes, people are going to judge you, but they'll judge you for 30 seconds and they go off and do something else. Once you've got that first thing done, then you can say, okay, this is what I would do differently. We're a lifetime of learning.
Yeah, and we should forget about ourselves also, in the sense that we shouldn't beat ourselves up. Because one thing that I learned from an interview guest, it was actually Hamid from Pakistan, and he said that we should turn our ego into an egg and break it. Because that way we can learn better and we are not afraid of making mistakes.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing, isn't it? As an adult learner, we are frightened of looking stupid. And I always equate this. I said, as an adult, we can speak in our native tongue very happily, we're confident. Speaking in the language we're learning, I think we sound like a 5-year-old toddler.
Yeah.
And to other people, yeah, okay, I understand, but that sort of toddler language, because that's what we're doing, because we haven't, we're very much as the book, we're not putting in expressions, we're not maybe using a little bit of natural slang. We are, well, this is what it said in the grammar book, and this is what I'm going to say.
Yeah.
It's not natural. And we're like 5-year-old toddlers, and that's not good for our ego as an adult.
And Sheila, have you ever considered making a podcast in Spanish?
I have done. Yes, I have done. I think the thing is, I've got so many brilliant people coming up on the podcast, and it really has changed since I've gone over to doing 2 a month instead of 4. And I don't know why, but all of a sudden, people are just coming across my radar, which is absolutely fantastic. So I'm not really sure what's changed, but I'm eternally grateful for it. So, I've got to start thinking, how would I feel doing a podcast in Spanish? I think the first thing is just to do it and then listen back to it and see how it comes across. If it's completely rubbish, I wouldn't want to put it out, because that's not fair on anybody's ears. I'm pretty good at holding a conversation in Spanish, but I think it would have to be a reasonably simple topic to start with. And the interesting thing, Spanish people speak incredibly quickly. So I think for them as well, they would have to slow down. I think that's one thing I would be very, very conscious of, because a lot of people have said to me, I listen to your podcast as language learning. So if it's in Spanish, it may well be English people will listen to it because they're learning Spanish. So again, when I'm learning Spanish, it doesn't work with me listening to somebody who's speaking Spanish at 100 miles an hour, which is the natural speed of the speech, because I'm listening for the vocabulary, the pronunciation, the rhythm of what they're saying. So they would really have to slow down, and that wouldn't come naturally to Spanish people. So I think picking somebody who would understand that, I think is going to be very, very important for me and for the listeners. But it is definitely on the goal sheet to do. For me, is for growth as well, for personal growth. Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
I would definitely listen to it.
Oh,
I would-
you'd be my first listener then, Daniel.
or I could also be a guest of yours.
Yes, you could. Absolutely. We could do, a slow Spanish podcast. That would be great, because this is the beauty of podcast. We can be commuting, exercising in the supermarket. We are language learning. And okay, you're not listening intently, but it's still, it's still
Yeah, it still
Spanish,
helps.
Italian, French, German, English in your ears as you go about your normal daily life. Yeah. I think we're incredibly lucky to have the medium of podcasting and YouTube for language learning.
Oh yes, oh
Yeah.
yes.
I mean, I'm convinced with podcasting and YouTube, you would not have to spend a single penny on a language book. There is so much stuff out there. There are so many teachers that generously give their time and their expertise. And yeah, we all seem to be quite comfortable with language learning, on our screens and in our ears, as opposed to going to classes. Yeah. And if that works for you, absolutely go for it.
Yeah, nowadays we even have Chat GPT, which is helping.
Yeah, I haven't looked into that yet, but that's something definitely I need to explore. But yeah. So Daniel, thank you so much. What an interesting conversation
Thank you
about
for
the
having
world
me.
of podcasting and how it can help us with language learning. So good luck with your My Fluent podcast and the Vocab Man.
Thank you very much, Sheila.
Thank you, Daniel.
Bye.